A millionaire stepped over two freezing kids on the street, until the boy looked up and said, "My sister's really cold." What happened next changed all their lives forever. Snow blanketed the streets of New York in a thick icy silence that muffled the usual hum of the city. Even the honking horns and flashing headlights seemed distant beneath the weight of winter. Gray clouds loomed overhead like a ceiling pressing down, and every breath in the open air became a puff of frost. People moved quickly, heads down, bundled in coats, scarves and gloves, their eyes fixed forward, their minds set on getting indoors as fast as possible. No one had time to look around. No one noticed the two children sitting motionless, on the frozen pavement outside one of the city's tallest office buildings. The boy looked to be about 7. His arms were thin, his bare feet red and cracked from the cold. He wore a short-sleeved blue t-shirt and faded jeans far too light for the bitter wind that whipped through the city streets. His brown hair stuck to his forehead, damp from the snow melting on his skin, and his eyes, dark and steady, remained focused not on the building, but on the little girl in his lap. She was maybe 4 years old, blonde and blue-eyed, dressed in a light pink dress more suited for a summer picnic than the freezing street. Her lips were trembling, her cheeks were pale, and tears ran silently down her face. The only thing between them and the full force of winter was a thin, worn-out sky-blue blanket wrapped around both their shoulders. The boy held her close, arms tightly around her small body, his own shivering violently as he tried to shield her with what little warmth he had left. Dozens of people walked past them, well-dressed professionals on their way to work, delivery drivers with their hands full, pedestrians just trying to survive another winter morning. A few glanced down, one woman hesitated before walking faster. No one stopped, no one asked. Edward Clayton was already halfway up the stairs when he saw them. He had been focused on the meetings ahead, the calls waiting, the files to review. As always, his mind was organized into compartments: finances, strategy, market analysis. There was no room in his life for chaos, and certainly none for emotion. But something about the stillness of those two small figures caught his eye. He paused at the top step and turned. At first he wasn't sure what he was seeing, just a mound of fabric on the ground. Then he saw the boy lift his head. Their eyes met, and something in Edward's chest shifted. The boy didn't flinch or beg, he just held his sister closer, like she was the only thing left in the world that mattered. Edward stepped down slowly, his polished shoes crunching in the snow. As he approached, the boy's lips parted and he spoke, voice barely louder than the wind. "My sister's really cold." It wasn't a plea, it was a statement. Honest, direct. The kind of sentence that didn't ask for pity. It demanded attention. Edward stood in front of them, looking down, unsure what to say. He had built a billion-dollar company, negotiated international deals, shut down entire markets. But in that moment, words escaped him. He crouched slowly, removing his leather gloves, and reached for the girl. She didn't resist. Her head fell against his chest, like she'd already given up. The boy watched with wary eyes, but didn't stop him. He just held tighter to the blanket, until Edward had gently lifted her into his arms. "I'm taking you with me," Edward said quietly, and the boy, after a brief moment, stood up on numb feet, and followed. He stumbled once on the icy sidewalk but kept walking, never taking his eyes off his sister. Behind them, the city's rhythm continued, oblivious. But something irreversible had just begun. The bright fluorescent lights of the emergency room buzzed softly overhead as Edward sat rigidly in a plastic hospital chair, staring through the glass panel that separated him from the two children now resting under warm blankets. Nurses moved quietly around them, checking vitals, adjusting IVs, whispering in tones reserved for tragedy or miracles. Doctors had rushed them in upon arrival, concerned primarily for the little girl, whose body temperature had dropped to dangerously low level. Her pulse had been faint, her breathing shallow. The boy, though also hypothermic and severely dehydrated, had stubbornly remained conscious, refusing to lie down until he saw his sister being treated. Edward hadn't said much. After the children had been taken in, he'd stayed behind every step of the way, answering questions when asked, giving his name, explaining how he'd found them. But mostly he watched. Not the way someone watches strangers out of curiosity, but with a gnawing sense of something personal he couldn't define. The image of that boy wrapped around his sister outside his building lingered in his mind like smoke. That look in his eyes, the quiet, unwavering determination, stuck to Edward's thoughts like frost to glass. The boy's name was Lucas. The girl was Sophie. The nurse who had taken down their basic information told Edward that Lucas had spoken very little. He had answered questions directly, but with caution, always looking toward his sister as though measuring whether to trust each moment. Sophie hadn't spoken at all since they arrived. She remained silent, her tiny frame curled on the hospital bed, the same worn blue blanket clutched tightly in her hands. The children were placed in a small pediatric recovery room. Lucas lay on a separate cot next to Sophie's bed, though he kept trying to pull his blanket over to her, even in sleep. The staff had offered to move them both into a temporary care facility once their vitals stabilized, but Edward had shaken his head before they could finish the sentence. He hadn't made any official decisions yet, no paperwork had been signed, but in his mind there was no question, they were staying with him. A social worker arrived a few hours later. She had a clipboard and a tired expression, clearly used to situations far worse than this. She asked Edward why he'd brought the children in, what his relationship was to them. He answered honestly, he had no relationship, no connection, just that he'd found them outside his office building, freezing, and alone. Her eyes narrowed with practiced skepticism. And you just picked them up? They needed help, Edward replied calmly, no one else stopped. She glanced through the window at the children, then back at him. That's unusual, Mr. Clayton. Most people call someone, not carry them into an ER themselves. Maybe most people should rethink their priorities, he said, his voice sharper than intended. There was a pause. She didn't press further but made notes on her form. Eventually she explained that Child Protective Services would be notified, and that a temporary placement would be arranged once the children were released from care. He nodded, but inside a tight knot of resistance was growing. Later that night, long after the nurses dimmed the lights in the recovery room, Edward stood beside Lucas's cot and watched the boy sleep. The child's hand was loosely curled in Sophie's blanket, as if afraid someone might take it away. Sophie, still pale, had shifted slightly in her sleep, her tiny fingers now resting on Lucas's wrist. They had no one else. No parent would be arriving in the morning, no emergency contact, no guardian. He had asked the nurse and she had quietly told him what the file said. The mother had died of an overdose 6 months ago. The father was in prison, serving a sentence for armed robbery. The children had been placed briefly with a distant relative but they'd run away, no one had reported them missing. They were in every legal and practical sense, forgotten. Edward felt a pressure in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Not fear, not anxiety, but something deeper and heavier. The kind of feeling that rises when you suddenly realize your life has shifted direction, and there is no map to follow from here. He couldn't understand it, not fully, but he also didn't question it. From the moment Lucas looked up at him on the street and said, "My sister's really cold," something inside him had changed. He pulled a chair close to their beds and sat down. The nurses had offered to find him a private room upstairs, but he declined. He didn't want to leave them. He sat there until the sky outside began to pale and the city stirred back to life. As dawn touched the tops of buildings and bathed the hospital windows in gray light, Lucas stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open. When he saw Edward still sitting there beside them, his brow furrowed in confusion. "You didn't leave?" the boy asked, voice hoarse from sleep. Edward looked at him and said without hesitation, "No, and I'm not going to." The hospital released the children 2 days later, once the doctors were satisfied that their vitals had stabilized and no immediate medical danger remained. Sophie had started speaking in quiet broken whispers, mostly to Lucas, but occasionally to the nurses as well. Her voice was soft, fragile, like it wasn't used to being heard. Lucas had begun eating again, though only once he'd made sure Sophie had enough food in front of her. The blue blanket never left their side. Even when folded and washed by the hospital staff, it always found its way back to Sophie's arms, and no one dared to remove it again. Edward stood at the discharge desk, signing forms he hadn't expected to sign just days earlier. Temporary custody, emergency release documentation, contact numbers. His signature appeared at the bottom of every page with sharp precision, but inside he felt like he was writing a contract in the language he was still learning to speak. This was not a business acquisition, these were two children who had appeared in his life like an unanswered prayer, or maybe a challenge. He wasn't sure which yet. He brought them home that afternoon. The car ride was quiet. Sophie clung to her bear-shaped pillow, sitting in the back seat beside Lucas, who watched the city go by with wary, untrusting eyes. Edward glanced at them occasionally through the rearview mirror, and every time he did, he felt the pressure of responsibility pushing deeper into his chest. He wasn't a parent. He wasn't even sure what that really meant, but he knew this much. Sending them to a state-run shelter or foster care wasn't an option. When they arrived at the penthouse, it was clear the place wasn't ready for children. The space was enormous: cold marble floors, high ceilings, minimalist furniture in shades of black, gray and steel. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a breathtaking view of the skyline, but the children didn't look up. They stood just inside the doorway, side by side, holding on to each other. Edward realized that what he considered a home looked more like a showroom to them. Beautiful, but untouched, sterile, and intimidating. He tried to ease their transition, speaking softly, giving them a tour of the rooms they could now call theirs. The guest bedroom was quickly designated for them both. He asked his assistant to have 2 proper beds delivered, along with toys, clothes, blankets, night lights and anything else she thought children their age might need. Still, he noticed that Lucas didn't unpack his small paper hospital bag. He simply sat on the edge of the bed, and kept looking around like it was all temporary, like they could be sent away at any moment. That night Edward made them dinner himself. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't even good, overcooked pasta and canned sauce, but he served it with quiet effort, and when Sophie smiled slightly and said, "It's warm," he felt like he had won something priceless. They ate together at the long dining room table, Lucas cautious, Sophie curious, Edward silent and observant. He realized he didn't know how to talk to children. Every word felt rehearsed, every question too formal. He asked about their favorite colors. Lucas said blue. Sophie said, whatever Lucas likes. That answer gutted Edward more than he expected. After dinner he tried to read them a story. He didn't have any children's books, so he found a simple one online and read from his tablet. Sophie leaned against him as he read, her fingers tucked into the fabric of his sleeve. Lucas watched from the bed across the room, his face unreadable. When the story ended, Sophie was already asleep. Lucas didn't move. Edward stood up to leave, but Lucas spoke. "You don't have to stay," the boy said flatly. "I know," Edward replied, "but I want to." Lucas didn't respond. He rolled over in bed, back turned, but he didn't say anything else. Edward took that as permission to stay a little longer. He sat in the chair near the window until both children were asleep. The next morning, Edward called a child therapist recommended by the hospital. Her name was Dr. Elise Monroe, and she specialized in trauma recovery. He arranged for her to visit the children at home that week. When she arrived, she spent the first session just observing, letting them play with blocks and speak only if they wanted to. Lucas didn't say much, but Sophie grew more relaxed as the minutes passed, eventually drawing pictures of a house with a big window, and a tiny stick figure holding hands with 2 smaller ones. Dr. Monroe stayed behind after the session, speaking quietly with Edward in the kitchen. "They trust each other, but not much else," she said gently. "Lucas is caring more than any 7-year-old should. Sophie is clinging to him for safety. They both need consistency, predictability and patience, a lot of patience." Edward nodded. He didn't mention that he had built a multi-billion-dollar empire from scratch, commanding the attention of rooms full of powerful men. He didn't say that patience had always been part of his discipline, because this was different. This wasn't strategy. This was survival. Not his. Theirs. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep again with her arms around the blue blanket, Edward sat in his office staring at the ceiling. The city lights glowed faintly outside. On his desk sat a drawing Sophie had given him earlier. 3 stick figures holding hands, standing in front of a tall building with a heart above it. He wasn't ready for this. He didn't know what he was doing. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel empty. He felt needed. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start. The first few weeks passed with slow, tentative progress. Edward began to fall into a rhythm he hadn't known he was capable of, and the children, while still guarded, began to show signs of subtle change. Sophie started laughing, softly at first and only in moments when she thought no one was listening. Lucas began asking questions, not about the house or Edward, but about the city, the names of birds he saw outside the massive windows, what certain foods were called. These were small things, but to Edward they felt monumental. He came to understand that trust wasn't something they gave freely. It had to be earned, through quiet consistency, day by day. The penthouse no longer felt like a showroom. Children's drawings now covered parts of the refrigerator and the walls in the hallway. Plush animals lined the edge of Sophie's bed. Lucas's corner had books, puzzles, and a blanket Edward had bought that looked suspiciously like the blue one they still clung to, just newer, softer. Edward learned their preferences. Sophie liked her milk warm with honey. Lucas liked silence while reading. They both hated the sound of slamming doors. Still, even with the calm settling in, Edward knew that peace in their world could never be taken for granted. It was fragile, held together by memory and fear as much as by healing. Dr. Monroe continued her sessions twice a week, always with the same gentle approach. She taught Edward how to recognize signs of emotional shutdown, how to be patient when they withdrew, how to show safety through presence, not pressure. She told him something he never forgot. You are not here to erase what they've been through, you're here to show them what comes after. One morning while Edward was preparing breakfast, the intercom buzzed. He had been making pancakes, an activity that had become something of a Sunday tradition. Sophie was still in her pajamas, curled up on the sofa watching cartoons. Lucas was setting the table with the intense precision of someone who didn't trust things to be done for him. When Edward answered the call, it was the building's concierge informing him that 2 women from Child Protective Services were in the lobby and requesting a meeting. Edward's stomach tightened. He hadn't been informed of a scheduled visit, and the unannounced nature of it put him immediately on edge. He told the children to stay in the kitchen, went to his office, and prepared himself for a conversation he wasn't looking forward to. The 2 women entered with the kind of politeness that felt rehearsed. One of them, the older one, introduced herself as Ms. Ramirez. She handled the speaking, while the younger assistant, Ms. Dwyer, took notes on a tablet. They sat stiffly on the edge of the leather chairs, asking questions in practiced, non-confrontational tones. How have the children been adjusting? Have there been any outbursts of behavior that concern you? Do you feel capable of providing long-term care, Mr. Clayton? Edward answered calmly, but not passively. He spoke about the children's progress, the therapy sessions, the routines they had built. He described their personalities, not in clinical terms, but with the growing affection of someone who was slowly, unmistakably becoming a father. He didn't hide that it was difficult. He didn't pretend he was perfect. But he made it clear that he was committed. Ms. Ramirez nodded, jotting something down. Then she shifted slightly and looked him directly in the eyes. There has been a claim of kinship custody filed, she said. A relative from the father's side has come forward. A woman named Caroline Bates. The name meant nothing to Edward, but he felt the air change in the room the moment she said it. As if a shadow had passed through the window, even though the sun was shining bright over the skyline. He is the children's aunt, biologically, Ms. Ramirez continued. She claims she cared for them briefly after their mother's passing. Under the law, kinship is a factor we must consider. A court hearing will be scheduled to determine whether the children should be placed with her. Edward sat back in his chair. They'd been here for weeks. No one else came forward. Where was she when Sophie had pneumonia? When Lucas couldn't sleep through the night without flinching? Miss Dwyer typed furiously but said nothing. We understand your concerns, Ms. Ramirez said carefully, but the law prioritizes biological family, especially if they are willing to provide care. She's not family, Edward said, his voice firmer. Not to them. They are safe here. And if anyone tries to take them away from me, they'll have to go through every level of the law to do it. The meeting ended on polite terms, but the moment the door closed behind them, Edward felt something shift inside him. The calm he had built was no longer steady. It was under threat. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, he dug deeper into Caroline Bates. It wasn't hard. She had a history. multiple run-ins with law enforcement including child endangerment complaints that had been dismissed due to lack of evidence. Nothing that would disqualify her in the eyes of an overburdened system, but enough to make Edward furious. The next day, he contacted his legal team. He wanted full custody, official, permanent, untouchable. But there was one thing he had to do first. He sat down with Lucas on the balcony, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows on the floor. The boy looked at him, quiet but curious. "I need to ask you something," Edward said. "This woman, Caroline Bates, do you know her?" Lucas's face changed, his eyes darkened and his posture stiffened. He nodded once, slowly. "She used to hit Sophie," he said. "Said it would make her learn her place. She locked us in a closet once because we spilled juice." Edward didn't say anything right away. His hands clenched slowly around the armrest of the chair. He looked at Lucas, who was staring out at the buildings like he was somewhere else entirely. "I won't let her near you again," Edward said quietly. "I swear to you." Lucas looked at him then, and for the first time there was something different in his expression, a flicker of belief, of hope, a weight shifting off his narrow shoulders. "Okay," he whispered, "I believe you." Edward nodded, but inside, his resolve was already cemented. He would fight. Not because he had to, because they were his now, not just by proximity or circumstance, but by something deeper, something that didn't require blood to feel real. Something called love. The court summons arrived exactly 1 week later, printed on thick paper, and delivered by courier to Edward's office. It was formal, sterile, and cold, like most legal documents, but the message it carried felt personal in a way few things ever had. A custody hearing had been scheduled. Caroline Bates, the children's paternal aunt, had officially filed a claim for legal guardianship of Lucas and Sophie. The hearing was set to take place in 2 weeks. Edward read the letter once, slowly, and then again, just to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding. Each word pressed heavier on his chest than the last. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Edward stood by the living room window staring out over the lights of Manhattan. His reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, tired, tense, deeply human in a way he had spent most of his life avoiding. For years he had surrounded himself with power and precision, always staying several steps ahead of any problem. But this wasn't a hostile takeover or a corporate loophole to be closed. This was a family, his family, and someone was trying to tear it apart before it had even fully healed. He called his lead attorney, Joseph Brandt, a seasoned family law expert with a sharp mind and a reputation for being relentless in court. Joseph reviewed the case details, Caroline's file, and the recent CPS visit. "She has a legal argument," Joseph said. "Blood relation, previous guardianship, claims of wanting to reconnect. The court has to consider it, but based on her history and what the kids have told you, we can challenge it, especially if Lucas is willing to testify." Edward went quiet on the line. The idea of putting Lucas, a 7-year-old boy already carrying more weight than most adults, on the stand felt cruel. But he knew Joseph was right. If the court didn't hear it directly from Lucas, they might see Edward as just a wealthy outsider playing the hero. The next morning, Edward sat down with Lucas at the kitchen table, while Sophie colored nearby. The boy was eating oatmeal, his expression guarded as always, but he glanced up when Edward sat across from him. "There's going to be a meeting," Edward began gently, "a serious one. Some people are going to decide where you and Sophie live." Lucas's spoon paused mid-air. He said nothing, but his eyes locked onto Edward's with laser focus. "This woman, Caroline, wants to take you both, to live with her again." Lucas slowly lowered his spoon. "She says nice things, but they're not real." "I know," Edward said. "I believe you. But the people in court don't know her. They'll only know what she tells them. Unless you tell them the truth." "You want me to talk?" Lucas asked, voice quiet but steady. "Like, in front of everyone?" "I won't make you," Edward said honestly. "But if you're strong enough, if you feel ready, it could help." Lucas stared at the tabletop. Sophie looked up from her drawing, as if sensing the shift in energy, and scooted her chair closer to her brother. She didn't understand everything, but she understood him. "I'll do it," Lucas said after a long pause. "I'll tell them what she did. But only if I can stay with Sophie after." Edward nodded. Always. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Joseph built the case file page by page, documenting every act of neglect in Caroline's past, gathering reports from therapists, CPS, and hospital staff. Dr. Monroe agreed to testify on behalf of the children, explaining the progress they had made since moving in with Edward, the stability they had begun to develop, and the clear signs of fear triggered when Caroline's name was mentioned. Edward prepared too, not just for court, but for the possibility of losing. He couldn't sleep most nights, and when he did it was restless. He would wake at odd hours and check on the children, standing in their doorway just long enough to hear their steady breathing. He thought about all the things they hadn't had before coming to him: safety, warmth, gentleness, a voice. And then he thought about all the things they had now, and how easily it could all be taken away. The morning of the court hearing arrived cloudy and gray. The city was wrapped in fog, as if holding its breath. Edward dressed in a dark suit, not out of vanity or habit, but because he knew appearances still mattered to the system. He helped Lucas into a small blazer they had picked out together, something that made him look older, stronger. Sophie wore a soft yellow dress, and held Edward's hand the whole ride there. The courtroom was large but not grand. It felt clinical: wood-paneled walls, worn carpeting, rows of pew-like benches. Caroline sat on the opposite side of the room, her lawyer beside her, her expression composed but tight. When she caught sight of the children she gave a soft smile. Sophie immediately stepped behind Edward's leg. Lucas didn't look at her at all. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, entered and called the court to order. The lawyers began their work, presenting documents, timelines, arguments. Caroline's lawyer claimed she had made genuine attempts to reconnect with the children, that she was fully capable of caring for them. But her evidence was thin, just words, no proof. Then it was Edward's turn. He didn't deliver a speech, he simply spoke like a man who had grown to love two small people more than his own empire. "I didn't plan for them," he said. "They weren't part of any plan I ever made. But now, I can't imagine life without them. They aren't just staying in my home, they've built a life inside my heart, and I will do anything to protect them." Dr. Monroe spoke next, her voice calm and professional, detailing the trauma both children had endured and the progress they had made in Edward's care. Then came Lucas. He was called to the stand, gently, not like a witness in a crime but as a child with truth to share. He sat upright in the tall wooden chair, his feet not quite touching the floor. He didn't cry, he didn't stutter, he just spoke. "She hit Sophie," he said, pointing to Caroline, "and she locked us in a closet when we made noise. She said nobody wanted us, but Mr. Edward came, and now we're not scared at night anymore." The courtroom was silent, even the judge's pen had stopped moving. When it was over, the judge took a long pause, looking through the notes, the evidence, the faces in the room. Then she gave her decision. "Permanent custody will be granted to Edward Clayton," she said. "In the best interests of the children, this court finds no cause to remove them from his care." Caroline's face fell. She said nothing. Her lawyer whispered something, but she didn't move. Lucas stood and walked directly to Edward, who knelt down and opened his arms. The boy didn't hesitate. He buried his face in Edward's shoulder. Sophie ran to them too, wrapping her arms around Edward's back. The case was closed. But for them something was finally opened. A door. A future. A family. The days following the court's ruling brought a new kind of quiet into Edward's home. It wasn't the cold silence that had once filled the penthouse, the kind shaped by marble floors, sterile walls and years of solitude. It was softer now, gentler, the kind of quiet that came from safety, from relief. It was the silence of deep breaths being taken without fear, of children sleeping without waking in panic, of healing beginning not through words, but through the simple consistency of being loved. Edward found himself changed in ways that surprised him. He no longer woke up thinking of meetings or market predictions. His mornings started with the sound of small footsteps padding across the hardwood floors, and the voices of Lucas and Sophie arguing over cereal flavors. He had learned how to braid Sophie's hair, though clumsily, and how to play chess with Lucas, who had taken to the game quickly and now beat Edward more often than not. Evenings were no longer spent alone in his office but on the living room rug, surrounded by toys and crayon drawings, reading stories until both children leaned against him, warm and drowsy. But despite the peace that was slowly settling in, not everything had healed. Some shadows lingered longer than others. Lucas still flinched at sudden loud noises. Sophie would cling tightly to her brother if someone unfamiliar entered the apartment. The trauma they carried didn't vanish just because they were safe. It lived quietly beneath the surface, revealing itself in small, unexpected ways. But Edward didn't try to force it away. He learned to be patient, to listen when they spoke, and when they didn't. He learned to recognize the difference between a tired silence and a fearful one. And most importantly, he learned that love was not a cure but a foundation. Dr. Monroe continued to visit, sometimes in person, sometimes over video, and she praised the progress they had made. She told Edward that stability was more powerful than any medication, and that what he had created for them, structure, routine, affection, was already rewriting the stories they had once believed about the world. Sophie, who had barely spoken when they first met, was now singing songs in the kitchen and asking questions about everything she saw. Lucas, who had once refused to trust, had begun asking Edward things like, "Did you ever get scared when you were little, or do you think bad people can change?" Edward always answered with honesty. He didn't pretend to know everything, but he never dismissed their thoughts. He talked about his own childhood, carefully, not in detail, but enough to let Lucas know that he understood the feeling of being small and alone. One night, Lucas asked if he had ever had a family. Edward looked at him and replied, "I do now." In the middle of that quiet new life, something unexpected happened. It began with a phone call, one Edward didn't recognize from an out-of-state number. He almost ignored it, but something made him pick up. On the other end of the line was a woman with a shaking voice. Her name was Marlene, and she had been one of Caroline Bates' former neighbors. She said she had seen the court coverage in the news and she needed to tell him something. Her voice cracked as she explained that Caroline had not acted alone in some of the harm inflicted on the children. She knew of a man, someone Caroline had been involved with, who had been abusive, particularly towards Sophie. She hadn't spoken up earlier, fearing for her own safety. But after seeing Lucas speak in court, something in her had shifted. Edward listened quietly, jaw clenched, a chill running through him as she detailed things she had overheard and seen. He thanked her and gave the number of Joseph Brandt, asking her to pass everything she knew directly to his legal team. After the call, Edward didn't say anything to the children right away. He didn't want to reopen wounds. But that night, as he tucked Sophie into bed, she looked up at him and said, "I don't have to go back ever, right?" He took her small hand in his and shook his head slowly. "Never," he said. "You're home now." Later, he spoke with Lucas in the hallway, the boy sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, reading a book under the warm light of a hallway lamp. Edward sat beside him and shared what he'd learned. Not every detail, just enough to explain that people were still working to make sure Caroline would never be near them again. Lucas nodded slowly. "It wasn't just her," he said softly, "but she let it happen." "I know," Edward replied. "And we're going to make sure no one like that ever gets near you again." Lucas didn't respond right away. Then, after a pause, he looked over and said, "Can I call you Dad now?" Edward didn't expect the question. His breath caught for just a moment before he smiled, quiet, overwhelmed and full. "You can call me whatever you want," he said. Lucas nodded once, then turned back to his book, but the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly. The next day, Edward called Dr. Monroe and shared everything. She told him how rare and important that moment was, how it meant something irreversible had shifted. He didn't need her to say it. He already knew. For the first time in his life, Edward didn't feel like he was fixing something. He wasn't solving a problem or rescuing anyone. He was simply being there, showing up, staying, becoming the one person these children could count on when the rest of the world had turned away. That night, as he passed by their room, he stopped for a moment. Sophie was already asleep, snuggled under a new blanket, the old blue one still folded at the end of her bed like a treasure. Lucas was still awake, his eyes heavy but watching the stars outside the window. Edward stepped inside and whispered goodnight. "Good night, Dad," Lucas said, almost without thinking, and turned over to sleep. Edward stood there for a moment, letting those words settle into him like light. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. because everything had already been said. Summer arrived slowly, like a quiet promise whispered into the fabric of their new life. The warmth crept in through the windows in the early mornings, filling the once sterile penthouse with golden light that fell softly on toys scattered across the floor and crayon drawings taped haphazardly to the refrigerator. The city outside bustled as always, but inside, Edward's home, time had taken on a gentler rhythm. Days were built on routines, morning walks with Leo, the golden retriever they had adopted as a family project. Reading lessons with Lucas, who now devoured books with a focused hunger. Messy baking sessions with Sophie, who insisted on wearing an apron twice her size and covering everything, including Edward, in flour. Their world, though not perfect, had grown real. The walls no longer echoed with emptiness, and the shadows that once lurked in the corners had begun to retreat. Dr. Monroe, during her latest visit, had remarked on how Sophie now initiated hugs without flinching, and how Lucas had started to express anger without shutting down entirely. These milestones weren't loud, but they were enormous in their quiet transformation. But peace, Edward had learned, was something that needed constant guarding. One phone call, one letter, one shadow from the past could still shake it. And it did. On an early Thursday afternoon, Edward received a call from Joseph Brandt that started with 3 words he hated hearing: "You need to sit." Caroline Bates had appealed the custody ruling. Though she had no new legal ground to stand on, her new lawyer had filed a motion claiming procedural mishandling and emotional coercion during the original hearing. Joseph believed the appeal was weak, clearly designed to create public pressure, or worse, force a financial settlement. But it meant one thing Edward couldn't ignore: they had to prepare for another hearing. When he hung up, Edward sat in his office for a long while staring at the framed drawing Sophie had made months ago. It showed a tall man with 2 smiling children beneath a giant heart. That picture had once seemed like a fragile hope. Now, it was a reality worth defending. That evening, he told the children with as much care as he could. He didn't use legal jargon or speak in half-truths. He simply told them that Caroline was trying, again, to take them away, and that they might have to talk to some people who didn't know how to listen the way he did. Sophie clung to him immediately, asking in a trembling voice if she had to go back. Lucas, older now not just in age but in spirit, simply asked what they had to do. Edward looked at them both and said, "You don't have to do anything alone, we do this together." In the days that followed, Joseph and Dr. Monroe worked quickly to gather more evidence and professional testimony. Sophie's schoolteacher wrote a letter about her transformation, how she went from a silent, withdrawn girl to someone who now sang during art projects and held her classmates' hands during fire drills. The pediatrician provided notes on her improved health and reduced anxiety. Neighbors from the building offered to testify. Some had seen Lucas walking Leo with Edward in the mornings, others had watched Sophie gleefully decorating cookies in the shared lounge during a community event Edward hosted just for her. These weren't courtroom arguments, these were glimpses into a real life that had been built brick by brick. Still, Edward didn't underestimate Caroline. She had nothing to lose and everything to gain. When she walked into the courtroom for the new hearing, she wore a carefully chosen dress, her hair styled in soft curls, her expression rehearsed to show just the right amount of sadness. Her lawyer, younger and more theatrical than the last, opened with a passionate plea about biological rights and redemption through responsibility. But this time, the judge didn't need to be convinced of who the children belonged with. Her expression remained neutral, but her tone was firm. Lucas was asked once again if he wanted to speak. He agreed. Standing in front of the court, he didn't hesitate. "She's not my family," he said calmly. "She hurt us, she let other people hurt us. But my dad, Edward, he didn't just save us. He stayed, every day, even when we were hard to be around. He made us safe. That's family." Sophie wasn't asked to testify, but when the judge offered to speak to her privately in chambers, she agreed. When she came out 10 minutes later, she ran to Edward and whispered, "I told her about the pancakes." Later, the judge returned and gave her decision without delay. The appeal was denied. The original custody order stood. No further hearings would be allowed without substantial new evidence. Caroline's legal rights were fully terminated. Outside the courthouse, Edward kneeled down in front of the children and pulled them into his arms. Lucas allowed the hug now without hesitation. Sophie kissed Edward's cheek, something she had never done before in public. Reporters snapped photos, but Edward didn't care. The real story wasn't theirs to tell, it belonged only to the three of them. That night they ordered pizza, not because it was tradition, but because Lucas had declared it a celebration. Edward lit 3 candles, not on a cake, but in small glass holders on the table, and called them our victory lights. Sophie drew a new picture, the same 3 stick figures, only now there was a 4th, a golden retriever with a crown on its head. The penthouse, once cold and echoing, now pulsed with warmth and laughter. The war was over. The wounds would take longer to fade, but they would, because now they knew what they hadn't known before. No matter what came next, they would never face it alone. Autumn settled over the city, with a kind of calm that mirrored the shift within the Clayton home. The air turned crisp, the sky deeper and more golden in the late afternoons, and leaves began to swirl across the sidewalks like little dancers, rustling softly beneath hurried steps. For the first time in a long while, there was no looming threat, no urgent paperwork or court dates waiting on Edward's desk. The battle was behind them, what remained was life, quiet, messy, beautiful life, and the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding not what had been lost, but what had never existed in the first place. The penthouse, once a monument to solitude, now breathed like a living organism. Warm light spilled from the kitchen where pancakes were flipped on Saturday mornings, and sleepy laughter echoed through the hallways before bedtime. The once silent walls now held stories, Sophie's crayon murals, Lucas's science projects taped proudly to the pantry door, a photo of the 3 of them at the zoo, where a parrot had landed on Edward's shoulder, and refused to leave. What had begun as a rescue had become something much more permanent, much more sacred. Sophie had started kindergarten. She wore her backpack every morning with pride, marching out the front door with Leo trotting beside her as if he, too, had become her personal bodyguard. She no longer cried when Edward walked her into the classroom. Instead she kissed his hand and said, "I'll be back soon, Daddy," in a confident voice that still made his heart catch every single time. Lucas had adjusted to 2nd grade with ease. This teacher spoke of his quiet strength, how he helped other kids who were nervous or shy, how he seemed to notice when someone needed kindness before they even asked for it. He'd joined a chess club and spent long evenings trying to beat Edward, who had finally accepted he would never win again. Dr. Monroe had slowly reduced her visits, not because she was needed less, but because her work had been absorbed into the everyday fabric of the children's lives. Healing, she'd said, had found a new rhythm here. It was in the way Sophie no longer asked if they'd be moving again, in the way Lucas no longer hoarded snacks in his closet just in case. It was in the way they argued like siblings who knew they had a future together, who understood now that no one was going anywhere. Edward too had changed in ways that could not be measured by court decisions or external validation. He had stepped down fully from the CEO position, retaining only an advisory role. The board had pushed back, but he had stood firm. His identity was no longer tethered to power or profit. He had founded a non-profit named the Blue Blanket Foundation, inspired by the worn piece of cloth Sophie had clung to on that first freezing day. The foundation's mission was to support homeless children and forgotten siblings, those who had fallen through the cracks of a system too overwhelmed to see them. His own story had become the heart of that mission, though he rarely spoke of it publicly. The work was quiet, targeted and deeply personal, and it mattered. On the first anniversary of the day they met, Edward woke up early. He made breakfast, waffles with whipped cream and strawberries the way Sophie liked them, and lit a candle at the center of the table. The children had no idea what the day marked, not in any official way, but they sensed something special in the air. Lucas asked if it was someone's birthday. Edward smiled and shook his head. "No," he said, "but it's the day everything changed." After breakfast they bundled up and walked to the park. The air was cool, the trees turning brilliant shades of red and orange. They sat on a bench together, watching Leo chase falling leaves. Sophie laid her head on Edward's shoulder, thumb in her mouth, content. Lucas sat on the other side, holding a book he hadn't opened yet. Edward looked at them, at the 2 people who had once been strangers on a frozen sidewalk, and felt a quiet ache in his chest. Not of pain, but of gratitude so vast he could hardly contain it. He thought about how close he'd come to walking past them that day. About what might have happened if he hadn't stopped. About the boy who had simply said, "My sister's really cold," and the man he'd been before he heard those words. That night they curled up together on the couch, wrapped in blankets that were soft and new, but still, the old blue one remained folded carefully on the backrest like a relic. Sophie called it the magic blanket, saying it had powers because it brought them to Daddy. Lucas never contradicted her. Edward let them believe it. Before bed, Sophie asked him to tell them a story, not one from a book, but a real one, a story about them. He told it simply. About a man who didn't know he needed anyone, and two children who didn't know anyone would ever choose them. About a day in the snow. About a promise kept. When he finished, Lucas whispered, "That's my favorite story." Sophie, half asleep, murmured, "Mine too." Edward kissed them both on the forehead, turned out the light, and stood for a moment in the doorway listening to their breathing. This was their ending, but it wasn't really an ending at all. It was a beginning. The real kind, the kind built slowly, from trust, from pain, from love. The kind where no one walks away, no one gets left behind, and no one is ever cold again. This story ends not with perfection, but with something far more meaningful, transformation. It's not just a tale of rescue, but of redemption, where love is quietly built through presence, patience, and showing up again and again. Edward didn't become a hero because he had money or power. He became one because he stopped, listened, and stayed. The children didn't need a savior. They needed someone who saw them, believed them, and chose them. The beauty of the ending is in its softness. It doesn't scream. It breathes. It reminds us that healing is never instant, and family isn't always born. It's made, one safe night and one warm morning at a time. The final image isn't of dramatic closure, but of a light left on, a story told at bedtime, and a man who once had everything, but now finally understands what it means to have a home. And perhaps the most powerful part is this: none of it would have happened if he hadn't stopped.